Hi everyone, my name is Ranil Dissanayake from the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford, and this is my take on DIY CSAE. I'll be presenting my paper, which in the conference programme is titled Bad Intentions or Bad Execution, but which I've since renamed The Importance of Being Earnest. So, what my paper does is it looks at a pretty neglected area in the study of large public bureaucracies. There's lots of research on how people handle routine tasks and how best to incentivize them, and how people sort of produce project outcomes and so on. But there's relatively little research on the quality and determinants of the quality of decision making in public bureaucracies, which is actually a large chunk of what public bureaucracies do, and particularly it determines the actual kind of actions that all the frontline delivery, which is quite well researched, does. So what I do is I implement a really simple survey experiment in the UK government and the Department for International Development, where I basically ask them to undertake the kind of choice which they have to make all the time in their day-to-day work. I basically give them some information on two ways of achieving an outcome, and I ask them to basically just choose the better option. And what we do, the setup is really simple. They just basically have to compare the ratio of the proportion of the people under each option who get better off compared to the ones who stay the same. And in this example here, the top ratio is 3 to 1 and the bottom ratio is 5 to 1. So the second option would be the more effective option. We set up very carefully to make sure that they really recognize that the organization wants them to choose the best thing in order to improve outcomes. So we complicate this with a really simple experimental setup. In the control group, I give them no extra information, and the information and what I'll learn from the control group basically is the error rate. So how often people choose the right option in a very simple setup. In the first treatment, I tell them that the minister has been publicly backing the less effective option, but it doesn't change the fact that the organizational outcome that matters, the one that the government has put in their manifesto, is to maximize the outcomes regardless of the method that you use. And from this, I'm trying to identify the effect of a bad incentive on decision making. And this bad incentive may operate either by people fearing there's a career penalty from disagreeing with their minister, or simply from thinking that it's difficult and costly in some way to disagree with their minister. And we find from the survey that that is how people see the work. They do think that it's not a comfortable thing to do. And there's a second treatment as well, in which the minister supports the better option. And the reason we put that in there is just to see if there is a priming effect, if simply just telling people what the minister does sort of influences their decision making independent of any incentive effect. And secondly, we can see if the effect is symmetrical, if there is if you will, a reward to being friendly as well as there is a penalty to being challenging. And what we find is a really large effect, a 16 percentage point drop in the proportion of respondents who select the more effective option among the lower grades in the organisation. However, this effect is completely eliminated as you move up the hierarchical chain, where to the extent that the overall organisational effect is null. There is no effect of instituting a bad incentive through the minister's preferences. Basically, people choose to challenge their minister despite identifying it as a costly thing to do, which is a great result for the civil service and also for good governance generally. And it matters, though, why that arises, because if we think that that's a model for a good government, you want to understand what drives this willingness to incur personal costs in order to further the organisational objective, which in this case has been set by the government. So the preference in this experiment is simply that the minister expresses is independent of what the government wants to actually achieve. So I investigate some of the mechanisms through which this might come through, and so it might be that, say, just the more senior people are more able, and that when they're making a difficult decision under pressure from the minister, that ability comes into play more often. We see some evidence of such an effect, but it's not very large and it's certainly not driving the whole impact. It could also be that the kind of people who get promoted are the ones who are most willing to argue and to incur personal costs and so on. And we try and proxy that by looking at their self-reported willingness to challenge different kinds of people in their organisation, from colleagues to ministers. And again, we see some effect of it, some effect from this, but not really. It doesn't really seem to be driving the whole thing. So, what I do think seems a plausible mechanism, given the data and given some of the given the data that we collect, is that some of this, at least, may be being driven by norms. And I'm not the first person to start thinking that norms are going to be important in how organizations function. Georgia Clough and Rachel Cranton have made exactly this point in their book Identity Economics. Sam Bowles has gotten towards this in his book The Moral Economy recently, and there definitely seems to be evidence in the data that people recognize that this is a costly action, nevertheless report that this is what they would do, and they also report that this is what they expect others would do in the same situation. So that's a really sort of promising kind of finding. And where do the norms come from? That really matters as well, because clearly the more you can incentivize people to behave with probity, the better it is for an organizational outcome, especially when there's all of these conflicting personal motivations that may come into play. So in the first place, there is the Civil Service Code, which in the UK is very well specified and it's very well set up to deal with exactly the kind of problem that I tried to bring to mind in people during the survey experiment. It requires, for example, honesty, in which case this means sort of being willing to speak the truth even when it's a difficult thing to say. It requires integrity, in which it defines as putting organizational and social welfare above your own personal objectives, and it also requires impartiality, which it defines as fidelity to the evidence. There's also, I think, this is likely to be buttressed by intrinsic motivation. So in the department that I'm studying, we find that there is a very high level of intrinsic motivation in the annual civil service. It's called the Civil Service People Survey. And I suspect that the clarity of the objective and the identification with the objective makes it easier and more salient to consider the norms which get really reinforced at the senior levels of the civil service in making decisions. So where am I going to go with all of this? So future studies are looking to institute a few lab in the field experiments in similar but not the same setting to see if we can pin down the mechanism a bit more carefully. We're going to do a few more survey experiments to try and understand better the decision-making process, and we're going to move into a whole bunch of new settings. So that's more or less all I can summarize in the space of a short video. I've even set up a Twitter account to celebrate my this foray into the DIY CSAE world. So if you've got any comments or questions or thoughts, please let me know. Thank you.